Hey folks, welcome back to another Utah Real Talk. I'm your host, Charles Max Wood, and I'm here with Tina Cannon, who's our Utah State Auditor. Tina, you want to explain to people who you are and what the Utah State Auditor actually does?
Well, I think you explained it. So I'm Tina Cannon. I am the state auditor. The state auditor has responsibility for the honesty, the integrity, and the consistency in the financial reporting of all governments across the state of Utah. So that means the federal money that comes to the state, we do the single audit every year. We have oversight over state money, which is the annual comprehensive financial report. But we also have oversight over the colleges, universities, tech colleges, public education, counties, cities, school districts, you name it. If it's a government in Utah, our office has oversight over it. So it's about $100 billion in spending and assets across the state that we exercise oversight over.
Yeah. At the Utah County Republican Party Lincoln Day dinner, you were talking about how much fraud and waste and stuff you found. And I don't know if you want to just give those figures out because I was floored.
So the number keeps changing, but it's over $500 million. Now we're $520 million in waste, fraud, and abuse. So, and we break that up in certain ways. There's fraud, there's waste that we identify, but there's also abuse of the program. And the biggest chunk of that is in Medicaid. And we've identified almost 494 million in Medicaid abuse of the system. So we make recommendations. Everyone gets caught in the number, but the most important part of what we do is the recommendations back to the government entities on how to fix the problem and close those gaps so that taxpayer money is not wasted.
That's amazing. Doge, you're Doge.
It doesn't make me very popular among the people who are profiting off of that.
Right.
And I now have what we call the anti-fan club that follows me. Bunch of attorneys that follow me around every time I do a public event. So I appreciate this being closed room and they like to heckle me from different areas of the room.
Yeah.
They know who they are because I see them.
Yeah. Well, folks who have watched some of the other interviews we've done, either for the Utah County Republican Party or the Lehigh Live show, you know this room's not very big. But yeah, it's fascinating. And I think that's probably a hallmark of you doing the job properly is that there are going to be people that are going to go, I don't like that, right?
Yeah. Usually those that profit off of it, because we are subject to audit as well, because we always, that same group is always, well, who checks on you? And it's other state auditors. We are peer reviewed every 3 years. So other auditors come into our office and they review the methods that we use and how we do our investigations to make sure that we're following the rules as well. So there is oversight for the oversight body as well.
I have to just get you back in to talk about just the auditor, how that all works. I'd love to do that. I brought you in because last week, you announced that you had on Transparent.utah.gov, which, by the way, folks, if you want to know where the money's going in the state, go check it out. And then I'm sorry for the hours and hours and hours you spend going into that data, but it's fascinating to see where all the money goes.
Yeah.
But you put a page up because people were asking about MIDA, which is the Military Installation Development Agency.
Yes.
And specifically related to the data center, the
Stratos project.
Up in Box Elder County. So I wanted to talk about that. And I think people want to know more about that. So we're going to talk about MIDA today. But let's figure out when we come back and talk about audits.
Yeah, because I love to talk about audits. That's right at my wheelhouse. So we released the website 8 days ago, so it was a week ago yesterday. But we had been working on it for 2 weeks before that because I came back from a conference and all of a sudden all of our hotline numbers were blowing up. The email accounts are blowing up with requests for a review of MIDA. So I know that people like to think we just sit around and wait for requests to come in and we just have all free time and all free staff, but we are an efficient government entity and we don't. So we got together as a group and decided what can we do to answer these questions. And there's an overriding request through all of them for more transparency. What is MIDA and how did it have this authority? So we run Transparent.utah.gov. I encourage everyone to go there. We've put a lot of work into making sure that the taxpayer knows where their tax dollars are being spent. And MIDA already had a page out there, but we decided it wasn't going to cover all of the questions. So we made a larger page and made it more prominent on the homepage of Transparent Utah. And then we pulled in all of the information that we could publicly find about MIDA. How did it get started? How did it develop to what it is today? What appropriations has it had? And then, so we have all of the enabling legislation and then the history. And then we also put a map showing all of the project areas, because most people had no idea how many project areas MIDA had, and that all of the armories for every county across the state are under the control of MIDA. So it's not a small entity, and it does have a lot of statutory authority. And we decided the best way to answer the question was to put all that together. So I have an insanely great team. I don't do this work myself, but we got together and decided how we could do that in the most effective, efficient, and fast way possible, thinking we were going to be able to curb some of the questions that were coming in. I'm mixed emotions on announcing that didn't work, because it's created even more questions about what MIDA is.
Well, and I looked at it. I had more questions too.
Yes.
It's like, well, now what about that?
So we thought we were going to lower the workload and the requests, and we have done exactly the opposite. And I've been chuckling over it because we have a nonpartisan interest in this. And I know that because one person did social media from the Democrat side of the aisle and gave out an email address, and someone else was sending out an email address that was on the Republican side of the aisle. So we have a bipartisan reporting system now through two different emails that just somehow organically happened. So I know they're keeping really, really close. It is a bipartisan interest in this issue. And then someone gave out my cell phone number, my personal cell phone number. So I have a filter now on my cell phone because we are getting even more questions on.
Wow.
So we sent out an email response to everyone who had emailed, because it's literally thousands now that have emailed and requested more information over what our next steps are. So that's, I think, why this works out really well. Is it's a public, I'm going to tell you publicly what I've told everyone who's emailed us on the next steps that we are taking to give more information over MIDA. But what we thought was going to answer questions, or we hoped would answer questions, created additional questions. And that's good. That means that we are being transparent with the information that's out there. In fact, we even got a call from the office staff of MIDA asking if they could link to the site because they're getting questions that they can't answer. So, yeah, we're providing a service, and it's really getting taken advantage of.
Yeah. So I wonder, before we dive into kind of the structure of MIDA and where it came from and things like that, because hopefully, I know some people will go to the website and some people will go and they'll kind of glance through it. And then something like putting this video on YouTube, or I'm going to put an audio only format out as well. Right. And so people, they're more prone to pick it up as they listen to it or watch it. And so I'm hoping that helps answer some of those questions. But yeah, I looked at some of the projects that MIDA has done over the years, and I had some pretty big questions about those. And then the data center thing came up, and I'd been thinking about starting the show anyway, and the data center touched about 8 different issues that I wanted to cover. And so it kind of opened the gate to that. What I'm wondering is a lot of the interest that you're getting in MIDA because of the data center, or is it that and then other things? Or
so I think the big push and where the interest came from originally was the Stratos project. But as we had talked about it internally, most people had no idea, because it's not the first data center MIDA has done.
It's not.
Camp Williams was the first one they did, and that's been in existence for a while. So what I would say the interest is how it got the authority to bypass local government, because that's where the bigger question is. And to me, it's not about the data center. It's about the process that was used in getting the data center. And that's where we're trying to focus on, how did they have that authority? For full disclosure, I came out of local government. I was a county commissioner, a rural county commissioner at that. And I've made a lot of controversial votes in land use because it's land use. And
Right.
land use, by its very nature, tends to bring controversy with it. But when those votes were taken, it was after 18 months. In the one particular case I think of every time, where it was a very hot topic in Morgan County at the time. We discussed it publicly in open public meetings for a year and a half before we took the final vote. So it wasn't a surprise to anyone where anyone on the council was leaning, because we'd discussed it publicly.
Right.
The difference with what happened with the Stratos project is they were hearing about it for the first time and not aware of all of those discussions. So in the response from members of the MIDA board or from the governor or the speaker of the House and even the Senate president have been we need to bring the public along to what decision was already made. And so there has been a lot of backtracking over it. But that's really where all the interest bubbled up over that. And to me, that's the process. It was only, how did that happen? Because typically land use decisions like that are very publicly discussed.
Right.
Especially when you're talking about water in the state of Utah in a extremely dry year. Of course it was going to get questions.
Yeah. I think the other piece of it, though, is that, yeah, like all of a sudden it was a thing and nobody really saw it coming. And we're going to get into some of this too, because, some of the decision-making processes, it felt like it all kind of happened behind closed doors until it wasn't. And then the other issue is that it has some level of government backing to it, which feels strange to a lot of people.
So MIDA has government backing, or the project had government backing?
A little of both, and you can kind of conflate the two in people's minds. And so I think that's where a lot of that boils down. But I kind of want to get some history, and then we can kind of get back into how it comes into the Stratus project. But yeah, one of the things that you pointed out that is my concern is that, yeah, they do have that operating authority where they can bypass local authority and they can do some of this stuff. And it's like, I didn't elect the people on the MIDA board. I elected my county commission. I elect my city council to handle those kinds of things. And so there's a state entity that can just come in and do what they want. That concerns me. And then some of these other things. But in order to understand it, I really think we need to understand what the history is. So can you just kind of tell us where MIDA originally came from and what they were trying to do with it?
Sure. And in case any questions I don't answer on this, it is on Transparent.utah.gov, and there is a MIDA tab right there on the front page, and the history is there as well. So it started with Hill Air Force Base,
right?
And there were several aerospace companies that were building in locations close to Hill Air Force Base, but it came to everyone's attention that there was some property that was on the base that the federal government could surplus that would make a public-private partnership where Boeing, Aerospace Corporation, L3, Alliant, there were several that were talking about building their businesses there, and several that had built facilities off site, but that gave them the ability to do a planned development. And it's there. There's a hotel there now. My husband works in that area, but I'm not military, so I don't go on the base. But it's right there on the west side of Hill Air Force Base, right off of I-15, and that became the Falcon Hill project. So how they got started was Falcon Hill. If I back up farther than that, you can talk about the BRAC closures and how when there was a facility closed in Tooele County, and that got everyone worried about it. So they kind of conflated two groups in saving Hill Air Force Base and then becoming a development facility to bring aerospace companies that were doing contracts at Hill, letting them put their corporate offices there where they were closer to the military, and the military could then meet with them at those facilities, or they could go on base easier because you already had to go through the gate to get to those facilities. So that's where it started. And I don't think anyone's ever questioned that project. There are some very prominent Utah developers who were part of that project who have made money over it over the years. But it has been successful by all of the economic development measures, because there have been some major companies that have located their offices there. Some of them abandoned offices in other areas of Davis County, but those have been filled in with, I think there's a Weber facility that took one of them, but it's worked out, and that's where it started. So that it really had that success program there, and then you see it start to take on other projects.
Right.
And that's where it grows.
So just to back up, so it was, yeah, because when I read the website, it said something, you mentioned the BRAC closures, which I'm not completely clear on, but effectively it looked like they were closing some military related installations around the state. And so there was some effort to save some of those and keep them open. And then, to help facilitate some of this work that goes on, especially at Hill Air Force Base.
Right. So in 2007, 2008, when it got started, it was more of it was an offshoot over the Military Defense Alliance, I think is what they called it. And so it gets started there as it's fighting for, I'm trying to think of what the Twilla facility, I can't remember, but if you go back through all of the BRAC closures, if you're really familiar with what goes on at Hill Air Force Base, and I'm in Morgan County, but my husband is in the aerospace industry. My father-in-law was an Air Force colonel, and the museum volunteered at the museum the last 20 years of his life after he retired. And so this is the area that we're talking about right there. When they talked about closing, whether or not the base alignment, and which was BRAC, it was a federal program to decide, were facilities effective and efficient? Did we need all of the military bases we had? One of the facilities in Twilla had been identified and closed, and that kind of created a coalition who wanted to get together. Is there anything we could do to make a better pitch for why Hill Air Force should stay? BDO in Ogden was one of them. The Twilla Army Depot is, I think, the one that they closed. So they got together and formed a group to defend those. And I don't think anyone has any problem with any of that. And then, but that, as most good ideas start as a small good idea, sometimes they grow. In this case, it really grew. So.
Right. Yeah, and so the website shows MIDA kind of operating as a quasi-governmental agency, right? They can levy taxes, they can issue bonds, they can manage land use, and that's without oversight of other government bodies, right? So that's where we got into the, hey, the county really couldn't stop them, the city really can't stop them. They kind of have this authority. So did the legislature intend to create something with these kinds of powers, or was it just kind of something that built slowly over time?
So we do link out there to all of the enabling legislation, and full disclosure, I don't create the policy, and I'm not trying to comment on the policy, but you can definitely see the evolution over time.
Okay.
So, and we tried to put it there so that the history could be seen. And sometimes you see the authority grow, and sometimes it gets pulled back a little bit in the timeline, and then it grows again. And so you kind of see it fluctuates over time, and then where it is today. The legislature has created this. It is under Utah statute. It's in 63, chapter 63 under, if I quote the number, it's E or F, I don't know.
It's okay.
But it's out there.
You can find it.
But it's not the only one.
Good.
Yeah, it's not the only one. It's not, so it's a quasi-government entity, and it's not the only one. When you hear Inland Port, the Point,
Utah Lake Authority.
Yep.
Yeah, there are a bunch of them.
Yeah, there are a bunch that are now under it. MIDA's just the oldest one, but there are several others who also have these same authorities and can develop in the same way. And if there are concerns over what MIDA can do, these other entities can do the same thing. So.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of my concern is. I've been talking to a number of people that one of the powers is they can levy taxes is, hey, look, that's taxation without representation because we don't elect those boards.
And without me getting into that policy aspect of it, where it runs into problems with the state auditor is, once again, my oversight is financial. And so my job is to speak to the honesty and integrity in the financial affairs. And order to do that, we audit to governmental accounting standards. And for those in the private sector, there are private standards and there are governmental accounting standards, and they're not always the same. And one of the primary differences in governmental accounting is fund accounting. And the basics behind that is the entity that imposes the tax is the owner of that tax, and therefore you've restricted that funding based on who imposed it and the purpose of that entity. So it is restricted for just the use imposed by the initial agency. So in these situations, which a lot of these quasi-government entities are running into problems with our office because we require them to actually report that way, because that's governmental accounting rules. And so when you see in statute that they have tax imposition they can levy their own tax. It's what we also see them doing is saying this other tax imposed over here, we can now collect that tax from this other entity and claim it as our own revenue. And there is where we get into the oversight problems for my office, is that's not allowed in governmental accounting, and it's creating challenges for the way we deal with these entities, because the legislature doesn't always think that part of it through. One of the legislators called me this week as he'd gone through that and kind of figured it out. And he said, okay, well, who in the legislature understands this? And I'm trying to go through the CPAs with governmental accounting backgrounds going, yeah, there's my problem here, is not a lot. But governmental accounting is a thing, and we're running into that problem. So that's why the state auditor's office already had a lot of this on our radar.
I don't know if I completely understand the implications, I guess, of...
Think of it this way. So I'm going to go back to the Stratos project, not because I want to pick on it or I want to inflame anything, but it's the best way to illustrate what I'm talking about. So everyone knows that there was a deal struck, and part of that was in revenue. Property tax revenue is a local government imposed tax. So when you're using property tax revenue as a incentive to incentivize a business to come in, if the deal is being struck by MIDA and not Box Elder County, then we have you're promised someone else's revenue as part of this project. So therein lies our concern and why it hits our radar.
Okay, that makes sense.
So anytime we're doing tax increment financing, which is what some of these economic development authorities are doing, when you see, so let's take that tax increment financing structure into other economic development projects you've seen, you'll usually see a meeting of the minds. The school district, the city, the county all get together, and they may have an interlocal agreement that says, we will do this. Now that's the decisions and the discussion you're seeing in the Box Elder County meetings. So then the question becomes, did MIDA make the promise before? If the referendum happened or Box Elder County wasn't part of that, what part of that revenue is MIDA's? What part of that is Box Elder County's? But taking that back to a municipal authority, all of the responsibilities of the municipal government still existed to provide services to any business that goes in there, in law enforcement, in roads, in utility lines, in all of the oversight that happens, and the services that municipal government provides are all still required. But if the revenues have been promised somewhere else, then you're pushing that responsibility for paying those costs onto the local citizens, and thus you see the outcry.
I've had this discussion with interviews that I've done with city candidates, with county candidates, with, especially the county commissioners. And the discussion on the tax increment financing and, some of the other special districts that they can set up is exactly that, right? They're saying, hey, we're going to not collect property tax or some other revenue that we can collect in this area. Sometimes it's sales tax. Sometimes it's we're going to pay for this and not that. We're going to help pay for this for you. In return, we get whatever we get, kind of a thing. And so, the concern that most people have is if they're not collecting that revenue to pay for the police, the fire department, or in the case of the county, the sheriff's office and the, all of the services that they provide, then I wind up paying for it. And so what you're talking about here is that same kind of arrangement up there, where any revenue that the county would have collected or the city,
to offset the costs.
right, to offset the cost of those services that they have to provide anyway, then that falls back on the citizens. And what you're talking about here then is, did MIDA make the deal on the tax break before the county agreed to it?
Yes. Did they commit someone else's revenues to this in this deal? And so in those kind of discussions, that's why an interlocal agreement is done. And we check those interlocal agreements to assure that there's transparency in whose revenue was it, who got promised what, and then how long does the deal last, because that will impact how their financial statements are reported in these types of deals. So let's take it back away from the Stratos project and back to tax increment financing in general. So part of the concern that's happening as more and more tax increment financing processes or interlocal agreements are reached, there is concern that the method behind these is always, and full disclosure, as a local government official, I've been involved in those negotiations, and I'm not saying they're never a good idea. I have signed on to some myself. But you always have to take into consideration that the promise that is there is that it will generate more revenue in time. And therefore, you're giving up tax revenue now for increased tax revenue later based on that project. But all of that is dependent on the success of the project and where those revenues are over time. All of that is dependent on that contract, that interlocal agreement. All of those details are in there. So if you're bringing in the local government authority whose revenue it is at the very last minute for those discussions, and then you're telling them they will make this deal or they'll get zero, you're really tying the hands of the local government. Right. And that's why you're seeing that kind of push from local governments. The other part of that is, time and time again now, we've got more and more of these arrangements stacking up. And the biggest collector of that revenue is typically education. Right. So especially in rural Utah, when the education money is promised to another project, the money for education still has to be collected from somewhere. And Box Elder County has a very large increase for school tax right now. That was approved and is going into effect. People have that concern as well over, are these types of tax increases happening because we have promised a bunch of other economic development projects the revenue that should be funding our education in the first place?
Again, going back to some of the conversations I've had with city council members and things, right? You have HRTZs and some of these others where they've made deals, and the school district is now not collecting property tax for those areas, and yet still has to pay to educate the kids that live in them.
Yes, and we got that question. The office got that question over Salt Lake County and how many total in Salt Lake County were happening. So we had done some computations and put some information out on Salt Lake County over how many, because they have so many municipalities and so many school districts that are involved in these. How many of them are still there? How big of an impact is this actually having? So there is information like that out on Transparent.utah.gov. But you can see, at the risk of, maybe I've started to sound like the policy wonk or Charlie Brown's teacher, wah, 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 wah. And we lost people a long time ago because we're going deep into the actual policy behind it and then the financial impacts of those deals.
But I want to get to the place where, if somebody listens to this, and maybe you have to go back and listen again a little bit.
Sorry about that.
I want people to be able to come through, and then, if they're concerned about the data center, or they're concerned about some project in their neighborhood or in their county or whatever, they can look at it and go, okay, I think I understand what's going on here and where the trade-offs are and who's making those decisions and why that may or may not be a good idea. Because like you said, I don't know that it's always a bad idea. A lot of times, we're in Lehi, Utah. So in the grand scheme of things, they've done some of those here before, But a lot of those now don't make a lot of sense because we don't need the kind of growth that it would bring in.
Well,
And so
let's just
that's what we're talking about.
So the one I'm the most familiar with, because we did do an audit and a review of Vineyard. And part of the concern and what was happening in Vineyard, when you had Alpine School District split into 3, and the question became, who's going to take Vineyard? Because Vineyard's whole economic development model in the creation of Vineyard, we've promised the vast majority of the education money for Vineyard for those economic development projects within Vineyard. And none of the school districts wanted to take Vineyard because it doesn't contribute to the cost of the education of the children within Vineyard. And it's a young community. So these are the real impacts of it long term. And that's why it's a cumulative effect. One may be a great idea, but once you get to 25, 30, 45, 50, how many of these before the impact becomes now we're going back and asking for a tax increase to actually pay for what is now being diverted over to these projects. And each project may be a great project in 10, 15 years, 20 years on some of them. In Vineyard's case, they just renewed it. Only one in the state that could renew automatically for another 25 years.
Yeah.
And the question then becomes, how do you pay for the education of these children then without going back to the taxpayer and asking for an increase? And now instead of taxing them for education, basically you're taxing them for economic development projects. And that tends to make people uncomfortable.
And that echoes back to the Stratus project with, is the tax then covering the education or other services that we need to provide, or is it covering for those things because we promised the money to this project?
And so all of that to me is very different than, do you want a data center, yes or no?
Right.
And it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, I had Ernie John here. He's a city council member in American Fork, but he works for the water district. And so we talked through all the water and stuff, right? And it came down to the same kind of discussion where it's like, look, it's not, do you want a data center, yes or no? It's, if they do what they're planning to do, how does that impact the water, and how does that actually play into things, right? And so then we could have a more nuanced discussion of, well, if it looks like this, then that's probably okay, and if it looks like that, then it probably isn't.
But even in the reassurance to the public that these are the discussions we've had, and I can listen into those discussions, and I can see that everybody's taking that into account, that brings calmness to the situation. When it's just surprises everyone, no one gets to feels like they're part of that discussion that got there. And then you brought up water. I think one of the things that's driving this, and I do see all of the audit requests, so I may have an insider's view on some of the concerns, but is what happened in Lake Tahoe. So if you've been following Lake Tahoe lately, there have been so many data centers put in Nevada that Lake Tahoe's power source is now being limited by the power that is now being promised to data centers in Nevada. And so Lake Tahoe's residents have now been told, you need to find a new source for power. Now, let's just take into consideration who lives in Lake Tahoe. This is not the poor section. They can advocate for themselves. But when that's the real impact of who, in a limited power situation, who will win, the public or the data center? And in that case, in Nevada, it's very clear it wasn't the citizens of Lake Tahoe.
And I think coming back to this, with the transparency and, the truncated timelines and people not being able to follow along with the conversation until, later in the process, people are looking at it and going, well, we can do something about it now, but if we wait, it may be too late.
Right.
One of the things that came up when I was talking to people about this was a concern over MIDA itself. And some of the projects that it's taken on, I think the big one that I've seen is the Mayflower Mountain Resort. That's up in
Wasatch County.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's Sundance. Yes, I am very familiar. Full disclosure, MIDA is a component unit of the state of Utah as a quasi-government. It falls on the state's annual comprehensive financial report. It reports as a component unit. All of its public infrastructure districts report as component units with the exception of one, and we're reviewing that one to see if that is a proper reporting. Yes, we are very familiar with this particular project and the size of it.
Yeah, it's a $420 million, 600,000 square foot, 13-story hotel, 387 rooms.
You also have a equestrian center, a
Uh-huh.
golf course.
Uh-huh.
There are other parts of the project. There's a condo development, there's retail development, there's it's a very, very large project. By the time you're done, you have on the public infrastructure debt financing, we are pushing it's over 900 million. You're pushing $1 billion in municipal bonding on that project.
Wow. I didn't catch that. That's not in my notes.
I just happen to know that.
Right. I understand that like 100 rooms are reserved for military members and retirees at a discount rate. And the Air Force receives 1% of the revenues from a special tax on the hotel income. Wasatch County Manager Mike Davis said that the original Mayflower Resort was not planned to include 5 luxury hotels, ski amenities, and more than 1,000 mountain homes, and that project is not within control of the county authority because the legislature designated the decision making to MIDA. So,
That's true.
does that pattern, locals losing control to MIDA, concern you?
I came out of local government, so
Right.
I was raised right and literally. So yeah, any time because a project like that does impact all of the resources that you provide
Yeah.
in your community. So of course, but that is also why a member of MIDA's board was then they added a board member to represent Wasatch County.
Mm-hmm.
So they've just switched that board member because one of the commissioners from up there, or they're a council, I think they're a council, has resigned, and they just replaced that member of the MIDA board. But they do have a representative on MIDA's board from Wasatch County because of the size of this project.
I gotcha. It looks like though the military discounts are reduced during peak seasons, and I guess my concern is, yeah, you have this huge project. It's not under county oversight, other than this one representative, I guess, and it's a major project there. So
Well, and that's where you really see the increase in MIDA's authority is
right,
under that project.
I was going to say it's
So
not
I think
really military. They're kind of
I think that's where the concerns that are being expressed, and again, I do see the emails and I appreciate everyone sending them to me, but there is a lot of consistency in those requests. In addition to a forensic audit, they're asking for who does this entity answer to? Do I have any
right.
local, any way as a local to be able to impact this project? And there lies the concern, especially in a project that is that large.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping it's successful. It's a lot of money that's invested in it and a lot of high-end properties in that project. So I'm hoping that there is still a demand for that level of, or yeah, I just don't even want to think about what happens if it doesn't have the demand for what's built there. But the overwhelming concern is in a development that large, in a state that is limited in water resources and power resources, it does have an impact to a community.
Are you talking about Mayflower or are you talking about Stratus?
I'm talking about both in
Both.
a project that
Okay.
size.
Yeah.
In a project that large, it's not a secret to anyone who's been involved in land use decisions across the state in the last 20 years that there is a limit to how much power is available in Utah's grid.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are talking about new ways to generate additional power. And if it's limited for what was already here, these types of projects at this size are also adding to that strain on that grid. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
breaking news in saying that because that's been part of that push and that limitation on the amount of development that can happen in Utah are the limited resources. Right now, that's power and water and land.
So yeah, so kind of going back to the kind of the scope of MIDA and its ability to do some of these things. Transparent.utah.gov dashboard shows that MIDA has created at least 29 project areas and public infrastructure districts across the state, with an increasing number in recent years. And over its lifetime, MIDA has spent more than $836 million, with over $235 million spent in 2025 alone, and has nearly $2.8 billion in assets. And so I kind of asked if this matches the mission, and you said I might be getting you in trouble. So I'm not going to ask you about that. But I guess what I'm wondering is what are the implications of having a state entity with this kind of the numbers on the assets and the money that it spends and things like that. Yeah, if the projects don't work out, or if there's some other issue and they have to, I don't know, draw more money from somewhere else or any of these things. I mean, you're the money person, so what happens if it doesn't go to plan?
Therein lies the concern and why we brought it to everyone's attention. So public infrastructure district financing, which is what is being used here, is a new thing. It was approved in 2019. This is about the time you see the increase in the projects under MIDA. So it wasn't MIDA that spurred the state auditor's interest in public infrastructure districts, but we are seeing, just so everyone is aware of the numbers and why it's a concern for the state auditor and why it made it into the debt affordability study for the treasurer's office for 2025, was that general obligation bonds for the state of Utah are at a record low. They're under $1 billion for the state of Utah right now in general obligation bonds. And we're all very proud of that.
That's just debt, right?
That's general obligation debt.
Right.
But public infrastructure district financing for the state of Utah is now over $4 billion. And in the last 16 months, you've seen a $3 billion increase in that type of financing. So it is a different type of financing, but these are still municipal bonding created by these entities. And when you figure what the debt load is for the state of Utah, the way any entity would calculate the debt load of an area, you have to take these municipal bonds into consideration. And that is a higher debt load than what we have seen in Utah in a long time. And that's why we brought it up, why we've talked about it. We also require a government entity who creates another separate legal entity that issues municipal bonding for public infrastructure. You would expect to see that included in the financial statements. And then I know from conversations that the municipal bonding market expects to see a transparent reporting of the debt load of those projects so that it is properly marketed, and because it is limited to sophisticated investors, that they know exactly how much debt that is and what the risk associated is. But what all that means is it's a different type of debt than what we're used to, but it's still debt and it's still there. And I think it is a question that the public deserves to know. So if the project, God forbid, and I am not hoping for that, but we did just have a record bad snow year.
Right.
I'm really hoping for the El Nino pattern. I would like to be able to water my yard. I like green, but there is that risk, and it's naive to think that there can never be another 2008, that there would never be another Enron, that there would never be any of these things. So we take a conservative approach when we are dealing with other people's money, and government by its very nature is other people's money. So we are supposed to be more careful. And last I checked, we were Republicans, and we were supposed to be fiscally conservative too. So I feel like it's well within that discussion of what happens if. Heaven help us, I hope that never happens, but it should be part of the discussion, and it should be on the table and an open discussion over. This is a very large increase in debt. What happens if, and is this a reasonable amount when we are so proud and we are talking about the record low amount of general obligation debt? Why are we not talking about this one over here?
So let me see if I can explain it just so that I know I understand it. So first of all, the general obligation debt is like me going and taking out a loan to pay for whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
Think of it as how we would be financing roads.
And so I take out the bond or the loan, and then I can spend it on whatever I feel like I want or need to spend it on. That's general obligation.
Right.
And then sometimes you have more specific use types of debt, right? And that's like an auto loan or a mortgage or something like that. And the state does some of those too. I think the municipal areas tend to do that a little bit more. But then what we're getting into is these public infrastructure districts. And so my understanding is they say this area gets its own little sort of kind of government entity that can issue those bonds, right? So they can get a loan. And so they get a loan, and then they put in streets or electric or plumbing or whatever else they decide that they're going to spend that money on, right?
I should not ask, because I've seen some of these contracts. And yes, there is a limit to...
Right. But the idea
by
is...
municipal bond ruling, it is limited to 10% private use only. And that's where when you see a huge project that is 100 rooms,
right,
is military.
But see, the cities do them, and that's where I've heard people complain about them before.
Well, I would separate. So
but MIDA's doing it too.
We kind of separate the ones that we look at, because we have what we call super PIDs, and we have the regular PIDs.
Okay.
So when we do counties and cities that do public infrastructure districts, they don't have the same authority as the super districts do, which is MIDA.
Okay.
MIDA has a lot more authority. So the payback for the bonding in those situations can be paid by other additional revenue sources beyond property tax. So when you're doing it in a city or a county, typically you can have a mixed use, which is commercial and residential, but we've seen them just residential. But it is not tax increment financing the way you're used to seeing tax increment. It is an additional tax line on that property. So you take the Wahali district, public infrastructure district in Colville. That bond is it's over 400,000 every lot. That's the property tax assessment on that PID.
Oh, wow.
So we're not talking about they can do the typical limitation, because there's a mill levy limitation on most property taxes. That's not applying in the same way in these. So you're seeing a property tax line, like if you take the one in Black Desert, one of the biggest complaints that we've had on this is a studio apartment owner that bought it's a studio condo in Black Desert in Washington County. They have a property tax bill of $10,000. $8,000 of it is the public infrastructure district debt. So on a studio condo. So that's what we're talking about here when a county or a city does it.
Right.
That's an additional property tax payment
to pay off that debt.
And passed on to the property owner. Same concept.
Sounds like there's a whole nother line
so
to
show.
That's
why you're starting to see in other states, like in Texas, they call them MUDs in Texas, not PIDs, and you'll see signs on developments that'll say no MUD, because people want to know that, you don't have this additional tax line if you buy in here. But like in Colorado, when they do it, they won't approve a public infrastructure district without a public vote first. Utah doesn't have that requirement. So you're able to put these in with just the public infrastructure district board. And in the city's cases, they're appointing a board that is just the developer. So you don't really have, and you don't have the same incentive to keep the debt low, because you're able to pass it on. And it's removing the market costs, because I've heard legislators who have developed these, who sponsored this legislation, really push back on me on this. They feel like it is bringing the costs down. And it does, if everybody is fully aware of that additional tax line. But if they don't know that they've bought it until they get to closing, then nobody did know. And so it's not transparent in what's going on. And that's why the complainant in Black Desert is so angry about it, is he did not know until after he got to closing. And then you're emotionally tied to the project or the home, and didn't feel like you could get out of it. There's where that's a different one. Now let's go back to
I was going to say, what does this mean for MIDA? Yeah.
So MIDA can do the very same thing. So the theory is here, and these have gone before the Debt Review Commission, which I'm part of, and I have given them a hard time, so they don't like me on the Debt Review Commission committee either. But their argument is this is a high-end development, and so the debt load that can be on these properties can be higher.
Okay.
Because these are higher end investors and these are second and third homes, and therefore they are more willing to pay a higher property tax. That may be true. The market will decide. But it also has the ability to collect other tax revenues in addition. So that's where you start looking at the other property tax lines. And that's where MIDA's enabling authority is varied, and it changes based on the situation. So in some situations, it can act like a municipal government. In some situations, it can act like a county government. You're seeing on the property tax lines in Wasatch County, there's a MIDA county. So you're seeing the ability for other revenue collection as part of the payback and the promise and the payment of that bond. And then you also have the proceeds of the sale of the property. So Utah is currently, we're buying and selling. What's interesting is the revenue does not have to return to the state's general fund. It can stay in MIDA and go to the next projects. It is, I would say that's part of what we will, the requests are for an increased audit, and that's one of the things we will be doing is a review of of the control structure for those projects in those public infrastructure districts.
All right.
I don't know that I will ever be able to answer all the questions. And I can tell by the look on your face, I didn't quite answer that one.
Yes and no. It sounds like for the most part, yeah, I mean, most of the time when I've been talking to people about the public infrastructure districts or the PIDs, it's done by the city or the county or both. And
not in this case. Board's appointed by MIDA. MIDA appoints the board because they're the creating entity. And so the development agreements and the projects are then development specific. So they're project area specific.
Okay.
So to answer the question for all of them gets more complicated because each and every one of them are slightly different than the other.
That makes sense.
So you have to review each and every contract to know what's in them, which is why when I went before the legislature this last session and we were requesting an additional appropriation to fund my office, my point was, you're not doing entry-level accounting anymore, guys.
Right.
You're getting more and more complicated in the types of entities you're creating and the public-private partnerships you're creating here, and that is a different level of oversight than what we've done in the past. Therefore, it takes very experienced accountants to account for it on the government side, and even more experienced auditors to audit to make sure it was done correctly on the oversight side.
And I mean, this just kind of occurred to me, but so on some of these public infrastructure districts, whether it's MIDA or a municipal entity, when they appoint the board, if the board is made up of the business interests around the project, now you have these business interests that have essentially been given tax authority in these districts, and those boards are not elected. You can't even generously say that the members of the board are elected officials.
No.
And so,
or at least not elected officials in that area where you can hold them accountable. And that's true of almost every public infrastructure district board. You do have at the point, you've got Cal Roberts was appointed at the point. I think it's Cal Roberts. Maybe there are two legislators who are on different PID boards at the point. So on occasion you do, but it's not a requirement.
Right.
But typically the requirement is it's the property owner. And so you'll get the developer, and the developer will be on the board. So if you have the developer setting the rules for how you're going to finance your public infrastructure district.
Yeah. And then they eventually mean to sell it, and so then it falls back on the owners who purchase it.
It's a way to develop a project because municipal bonding rates are substantially lower than typical development costs. So there is an incentive to create these partnerships because developers can now develop at a lower cost.
Yeah, but they also wind up passing the cost along to the owners who purchase it anyway, so...
I am not commenting on this.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move on because I think we've gotten a little bit into the weeds. So one of the things that people kept raising the flag on the Stratus project in particular was the speed, the timeline, right? And some of that's been attributed to MIDA. Is that mostly because MIDA was able to kind of bypass some of these processes that would typically go through these other, I don't know, the city or the county or whoever, or is that due to other things too?
So it could be both. I wasn't in any of the negotiations. I can just see from the enabling legislation that empowers MIDA that it has the authority to go in and it supersedes. In its enabling legislation, we tried to find a way to describe it because it becomes more powerful than the other governments around it.
Right.
Is it more powerful than the state? Because it doesn't have to go back and ask for permission from anyone. It can then act. And you're seeing that in the discussions and the letters back and forth over who was in the negotiation with the project, speaking for the state. Were they acting as the Senate president? Were they acting as the chair of MIDA? Were they acting as the governor? Are they acting as the appointment of 5 members of MIDA? So what they've created in a public-private partnership here, and it had another entity for a very long time called P3, which is public-private partnerships, and it's a facilitator that the whole point is to speed up the process. That's the point. And it can do that because it can supersede the local government. That's how it can do that. Okay. So that's what's in their authority to do.
That makes sense.
Well,
and it makes sense just going back to the
I
other
didn't
project.
say I'm not going to be the one who said it made sense on this podcast.
Well,
I'm going to say that's what the legislation allows it to do.
I guess what I should say is I understand
I
what
know
you're
the
saying.
anger out there. You brought it on yourself there.
No, fair enough. No, I guess what I'm saying is that I understand, right? So initially it was set up.
I'm kind of joking to bring some lightness to
right.
this, but at the same time,
it was set up to facilitate these projects for Hill Air Force Base and everything else, and so it was there to speed up the process.
Yes, and to be able to speak for and negotiate for the other entities in this situation. And now we've broadened how many projects it can do that for. So it's not acting differently, it's acting the way they designed it to act. The question and the anger became, but wait, that's broader than I thought.
Right. Is that an appropriate level of authority or not?
Yeah. And there is where I'm just telling you what it can do. Okay. And that's why we phrased it the way we did. What is MIDA and why can it speak for my local government in this situation? And that this is why this is what the legislature created and enabled it to do.
Yeah. All right. So I had a whole bunch of questions about like the scope, but I think we've kind of covered a lot of this. I'm probably going to come back through.
I see that question and I'm not answering that
question. I know. No, it's totally fair. I mean, some of these, and I think it's fair for you to say, look, this is how it works, right? We've done the work to understand how it works. Let me fill you in. And I also understand the position you're in where you're going. Yeah. I have to operate within this area. And so I don't want to go into the right or wrong of things. And that's fair. And a lot of these questions kind of lead that direction. And so I'm not going to ask them. I'm probably going to go back and do a little more homework and answer them myself in another episode.
But the answer to that is public pressure. For those of you who can't see the question, the answer is always public pressure. When the public became aware and you saw the outcry, that's why we created the site. That's why the is what it is people became very aware very quickly. And that's who we represent, is the public. So as a representative of the full state of Utah, independent of the legislature and independent of the governor, asked to do something to bring more transparency, this is what we did.
Yeah, that's your job.
That's my job. And so you're seeing the same way we responded, you are seeing those public pressure responses from the other entities as well in bringing more discussion to it. Right. And I think that's a healthy thing. That means you still have a government that is responding to the people they represent.
So I read somewhere, and this is not in my notes, but I read somewhere that the auditor's office doesn't have the kind of audit oversight over MIDA and its projects that it does over other parts of the state government. Is that true?
That's true, but let me explain why that is. Because, I have 51 members of my staff, and we have $100 billion in spending and assets we have oversight over. I can't possibly get to all those audits with just 51 people.
Okay.
So we contract out, and most of the contracts for audits, we oversee those contracts. Local governments will oversee their own, but we set the audit parameters for all of those. Of the state entities, we oversee all of the RFPs for those audit contracts, with the exception of MIDA. We don't do MIDA. For some reason, under the prior auditor, we did not do that contract. But that does not mean that I can't go in and do a special purpose audit of MIDA. And that doesn't mean that we have not reached out to clarify with the auditor who's doing that work that we'll be checking their work papers, and we will be making sure that they are following the standards set by the state auditor for governmental accounting, because I set those standards, and we can at any time go in and review the process that was taken, and we will. And then we will be a concurring reviewer on their fiscal 26 audit. It's under contract through fiscal 27. So we will oversee the new contract that goes out, but currently is under contract, and the state auditor's office, it does not do that audit. We do the point, we do inland port, but we do not do MIDA.
Okay. Because
in that we don't do their actual audit. There are entities like this that we do the actual audit for. MIDA is not one of them. However, we can still do special purpose, and we can still oversee the audit that's being done.
Okay. Because what I was reading, people were making it sound like there was some special carve out, and so it was there was a black box and a stone wall between your office's capability and MIDA, and it sounds like that's not entirely the case.
That's not quite true. It is interesting to me that it's one that we didn't oversee, but I think it is evolved over time, and typically we would rotate. Industry standard would be rotating your auditor every 3 to 5 years. We do that with staff internally, and you would do that with your audit firm that you contract with externally. But yes, so most of those super districts, we do their audits, so it is different, and I will give them that, and I think that's where that started. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't fall under my oversight, and that I don't have the authority to go in and do a special purpose audit at any time, whether that be performance, whether that be compliance, whether it just be a control review, and we've reached out to the audit firm, and we will add some additional steps as we review what has been happening in the past. So it is subject to additional review, and it is under additional review.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding correctly, essentially there's another audit firm that is contracted to cover MIDA at least for the next year or so.
Yeah.
But there's nothing that specifically prohibits you from looking at anything within MIDA.
Anything that they have done, even the audit itself and the work papers for the audit that have been done, we can review all of that.
One other thing that I'm wondering about then is within the deal that MIDA made, there was some tax breaks that were given and things like that. What do you know about that, and how do you address some of that?
With the Stratos project?
Yeah.
So I am not privy to any of those deals that were done, and I don't know anyone that actually is but we would be able to go in and review any contracts once they're exercised to be able to see what those are. And that's when, but we would always be reviewing that because that reflects in the financial statements.
Okay.
So there's where now that it's a new project area that falls under the jurisdiction of MIDA, it becomes a state asset and not a county project. So it's a lot of that will be determined in, did O'Leary buy the land, or is that going to be state-owned land? Because that's why the Falcon Hill project was interesting, because it's a lease of the land. The land is not owned by the entity who built on it. So same thing at Inland Port. The state will own, or not Inland Port, sorry, the Point. The state retains the ownership of the land in that project.
Right.
So we would review all of that for what the deal actually entailed, who owns what the revenue restrictions are, who gets the revenue. All of that would then be, because at that point you're probably splitting revenue between MIDA and between Box Elder County. So that's when the accountants go in and we earn our pay.
The final question that I have is, So there are people that are concerned, besides calling your office and asking you to audit the living crap out of these people. What else can they do with an entity like MIDA that seems to have this outsized amount of power to do this kind of thing?
The legislature created it. The legislature can change it.
Okay.
Yeah, but it is an independent quasi-government entity created by the legislature. What the legislature creates, the legislature can uncreate.
Yeah.
So there is still ability for it to be changed and evolve over time. And then look at the projects area, and that's a complicated accounting issue as well. So these are complicated questions and issues for what do you do with what it is, and then if you decide you're going to dismantle it
or change it.
Yeah. Because remember, MIDA is just the first. You've still got Inland Point, the Fair Park District, the Sports District, now we have a new power one that's statewide that was created in 26. There are a lot of these. It's not the only one.
Right. Yeah, but your point's well made, right? Whether they dismantle it or they come in and they say, we're going to drastically change the way that you operate. Yeah, what does that mean for everything that it's doing right now?
It does have an impact. And that's where my caution, even this past week, we had cautioned the point over these very same things, is you are not talking about entry-level accounting here.
Right.
And I have made that recommendation to multiple state agencies now. You can't do this with your typical off-the-street bookkeeper. You need qualified accountants who understand the structure you've created, because you're taking very complicated corporate structure and you're marrying that with government. And that isn't always a happy marriage, or is it easy to put in paper, in writing on your books? So these are complicated structures, and you need intelligent, qualified staff and experienced staff to do this kind of an audit. My pushback has always been, we can't do this type of oversight with these kind of entities with interns. This is doctorate level accounting, and I'm not exaggerating there. These are very complicated, and I think they have been made complicated for a reason. We are taking the power of government and the lower financing costs of government, and we are combining that with private business interests and creating a very powerful entity that can do a lot of things. The accounting side of that gets complicated and messy very easily, very quickly. So the oversight has to increase to make sure that everything done in the name of the public is actually representing the interests of the public and not unfairly representing the interests of the private side of the equation.
So I said that was my final question, but now I have another question. So how much of MIDA is private corporate versus government? Or is it project by project? And so each project is private and corporate, but MIDA is more government?
So as a quasi-government entity, they're entering into these public-private partnerships.
Okay.
And each contract is different. So that's why we listed all of the project areas.
Okay.
Because each of those projects are different. And who sits on the board, what the contract is, that's why I keep telling you, it's complicated, and each one of them are different. All of these projects are different. All of these contracts are different. All of the players are slightly different. You see some continuity in there, but the players change slightly. So
MIDA itself is more on the government side, but each of these projects incorporates both.
Yes. So MIDA is absolutely a government entity, a state quasi-government entity.
But it has the power to form these
I'm going to get myself into trouble with this one. But as we discussed it and how to explain it to people, we talked about it's the Trinity. And so I want everyone to picture that for a minute. It's kind of the Trinity. Depending on the situation, it changes what its responsibilities are. There are times it can act like a municipality, and it says in statute, in this situation, it will be a municipality. In this taxing situation, it's a government. But it changes, and depending on the project and the circumstances, the type of entity and the type of accounting structure changes based on that project. And the statute allows it to do that. So it's I would call it very nimble. It's hard, but that ability to change based on the project makes it very hard to account for all of the projects and make sure that you are fairly representing what is happening.
That makes sense. So at the end of the day, yeah, they have all these tools in their toolbox, and you can do the municipal thing, or you can do kind of the county thing, or you can do the local government kind of thing, or you can do, maybe
state.
Yeah.
Because state has different powers and different taxes.
And
so
you can do any of those, but then you enter into contracts with these other private entities to get these projects done, and you agree to use those particular tools or powers within your toolbox as part of the deal to do the project. And so each project will then, okay, we're hybrid over here, different from we're hybrid over here, because we're doing different things for this one than we're doing for that one.
And so that's where the oversight becomes very complicated. For example, if based on the type of entity that is in your commercial zone here, and there's a different sales tax rate based on the type of entity you are, you can have one building and one project that will have multiple tax rates, sales tax rates. And you could change within a building, you could change the tax rates based on the entity that's in the building. Think of how the tax collection for that works. It's very complicated.
Right.
And that's why I keep saying this isn't beginning accounting here. I am very empathetic for the tax commission to try to make sure that they collected the right amount of sales tax in these situations. It's very complicated.
Yeah. And then getting into the Stratus deal, where now you're talking about the commissioners and where they were coming from. And, we haven't gone into too many details or whether or not they made the right decision. And I don't know that I know enough to really make that call. But what you're saying is then you get into the interlocal agreements with the other entities, whether you're within a city or a county or whatever. And so now they're involved too, and that makes it even more complicated.
Yes. And in fairness to Box Elder County, if you've ever been a county official and you've had the state step into a project like this, you know that the state created local government and the state created federal government, so they are acting as your boss in most of these situations. And so you're putting the county commissioners in Box Elder County in a very difficult situation where they will have the costs associated with providing services to a project, but do they really even have the ability to offset those costs? And they're trying to represent the public when you've got an economic development partner that is already striking a deal that says something different. And you've seen that in the public comments that are happening. You're seeing the different interests. And even in the documents that have been released, you can see those different interests and where they're colliding and who won. I guess we're still seeing changes in those documents as it goes forward. So
we have seen some changes due to public pressure. Yes. And changes not just in the agreements, but also the approaches to different things.
Well, we've seen them in public. Look, we destroy our faith in our fellow men every day in the state auditor's office. We tend to see the worst of everything. But until it's actually in writing, and that's what I would caution everyone, until it's actually a deal in writing, and when a public entity, when a government entity enters into a contract like that, it is publicly available. The details will come out eventually. I've said the same thing about the private equity deal at the U. This is a public asset. The contract will be public. Everyone will have a right to know, and we will see that. And then we will know who actually got what in this arrangement. And that I will give that shout out to everyone involved consistently through the whole process, whether it was Kevin O'Leary, whether it was Stuart Adams, whether it was the governor or Mike Schultz. They've all said, we want transparency in all of this. And that's what we're trying to give you, is as much transparency. I think the advantage the state auditor has is we don't represent either party. We're just this is what happened. These are the facts. And so that's why I've tried to not go into the, do I like it? Do I not like it? I'm just trying to give you the facts of the situation.
All right. So if people are trying to follow along, I have to say the Transparent.utah.gov, the MIDA tab was very helpful. I think in some cases it answered some of my questions. I think in some cases
it caused more.
it opened up more. And then I think in some cases it was, okay, now I know enough to ask better questions.
Yes.
So are there other places that people should be looking, or is that kind of the best spot for people to get information about this project as things go forward?
And so, funny story, now that we're at the very end. So when it first started bubbling up and people were asking questions, they were going to MIDA's website. And so MIDA does have a website, but the links to a lot of their public meetings were broken.
Oh, no.
But on their website, it linked to my hotline, the state auditor's hotline. And that link worked just fine. Trust me.
You figured that out pretty fast.
It was working great. So there was a real attempt at transparency there because the state auditor's hotline was right on their website and people used it. So that attempt was there. But they have reached out over questions over how we've presented some things, and we've said, as long as you send us the backup documents, we'll adjust where it needs to be adjusted. We're moving it as people bring us more information, we'll supplement it. But the beauty of Transparent Utah was that we are not the local government and we're not the state government. We're the independent arbitrator of the information. So we're not biased on it. And that's why it's been a great tool for both the left and the right, because it's just, here are the numbers, here are the meeting minutes, here's everything that you needed to know. And that's what we're trying to keep it, is just an information source without a hand on the scale on either side.
Yeah. And I appreciate that, because then I feel like I can get facts that I can rely on, right? I mean,
I have pointed out the difficulty of the oversight, just because that I do know. But that's not news to anyone, because I've been saying that for 2 years or at least 2 full legislative sessions. The accounting for these entities is very complex. So I do empathize with anyone who's looking at it. But the point here is not, do you understand every bit of every part? There's an overriding question here that I think everyone is asking. Is this the right way to handle these types of situations? And this spurs public comment. So I have been known to say, and you've heard me say it before, that I quote Thomas Jefferson all the time: a nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be. And what we are trying to do through Transparent Utah is to provide you the information you need to ask the right questions and be an informed voter.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm looking at. And I guess that's the difference between my approach and your approach is, you're just trying to make sure that people have the information. I'm willing to put my finger on the scale, but I want it to be informed, right? I don't want to just come in and hair on fire. This is going to be really bad because water, or because power, or because they want to use natural gas to do the power, or because of the land use or anything like that, without really understanding what it means. And so I may put some interpretation on it, but I feel like that's kind of my job, is to help people understand. It's like, okay, here are the facts, which is your job, and then here are the principles. And so that informs, is this the right way to do this, and things like that. So I appreciate you coming and just kind of giving us the straight up, hey, look, this is kind of where it came from. This is, what it can and can't do. And these are the facts around MIDA, and helping me and hopefully a bunch of other people on the internet now understand a little bit better about this piece of the puzzle, not just for the data center project, which kind of seems to be a big deal right now, but for any other projects that come into play wherever you live or affect you in one way or the other.
And that's why the project map is there, because it's bigger than that one project. But if you have concerns about that project, you should look at the other projects.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, that was why I brought up the Mayflower project, right? Is because it was like, hey, look, in some cases, the concerns that I have over the Stratus data center
have played out
reflect
already.
and have played out in the Mayflower project.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And so, I can look at it and I can go, all right, are they doing some of the same things here that make me concerned over there? So anyway, but thank you, Tina. I really appreciate you coming. And
I appreciate it. Anytime that I get a chance to say Transparent.utah.gov over and over again, I'm there.
yeah, I'm telling you, if you want to know what the government's doing, that is such a good resource. I cannot commend you and your team enough for the work that went into that.
Thank you, because I have an incredible team. I am proud every day of the work we do in the state auditor's office. I have incredible professionals that do amazing amounts of work in a very short amount of time. I'm proud of how quickly we were able to turn that around.
All right. If people want to know more about the auditor's office, where do they look?
Transparent.utah.gov.
It's just there. Okay.
Or auditor.utah.gov.
All right.
And don't email my personal account. Just please. Please stop.
Yeah. All right, folks, we're going to wrap it here. Till next time. Max out.